They were born into crowns, castles, and the crushing weight of duty. 6 children of a single king. Some ruled empires, others vanished into silence. One gave up a throne for love, another died a boy, far from the spotlight. This isn't just a royal family tree, it's a map of ambition, rebellion, sacrifice, and secrets. What really happened to the children of King George V, and why do some names echo through history while others were almost erased? From coronations to quiet tragedies, here's what The Crown never told you. Before we dive in, if you love deep dives into royal history, scandal, and the strange turns of fate, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Let's see how far this royal rabbit hole travels. 1. Edward VIII. He was the king who never quite ruled. Edward VIII, born in 1894, came into the world with a crown already ghosting over his head. The golden boy of the House of Windsor, charming, fashionable, beloved by the public, and thoroughly disinterested in the stiff choreography of monarchy. From the start, Edward danced out of step with royal expectations, and when the music stopped in 1936, he made the most scandalous decision in modern royal history. He gave it all up. The crisis exploded like a well-mannered bomb. Edward's romance with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite, was more than a personal entanglement. It was a constitutional threat. The Church of England, of which he was nominal head, would not condone a marriage to a divorcee with living ex-husbands. Parliament was firm. The press, though silent for months under a gentleman's agreement, roared to life. And Edward? He chose love, or at least what he believed love to be. On December 11, 1936, less than a year into his reign, Edward abdicated the throne in a radio address that would become legend. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. Cue the heartbreak. Cue the constitutional reshuffle. Cue the exile. He became the Duke of Windsor, but never again would he be fully royal. His marriage to Wallis Simpson was quiet and uninvited by the family. He drifted from palace to pariah, never quite forgiven by the establishment. During World War II, he served as governor of the Bahamas, a position that sounded important and probably was, but felt more like diplomatic exile and tropical packaging. Rumors swirled of fascist sympathies, secret correspondences with the Nazis, whispers he would rather forget. He died in 1972 in France, far from the throne that once seemed inevitable. The man who walked away from kingship spent the rest of his life trying to matter without it. And while Britain reeled from the abdication, another royal was dragged into the spotlight, one who never wanted it, a younger brother with a stammer, a fear of crowds, and the crushing weight of a crown he didn't seek. 2. George VI. He was the spare who became the symbol, born Prince Albert. Frederick Arthur George in 1895, the second son of King George V, was never supposed to be king. He was shy, painfully reserved, and afflicted with a stammer that made public speaking a torment. But fate and his older brother's abdication had other plans. In 1936, after Edward walked away, Albert stepped up, reluctantly, and became King George VI. To understand George VI is to understand endurance. He didn't burst into the role, he clenched his jaw and endured it. This was a man who had served in the Royal Navy during World War I, who had fought at the Battle of Jutland, and who had lived most of his life in the long shadow of his older brother. Now, he had to become the face of a shaken empire, bruised by scandal and teetering on the edge of global war. George VI's reign began in chaos and was forged in fire. When World War II broke out, he and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London. Even when Buckingham Palace was bombed, they stayed. "The children won't go without me, I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave," the Queen said. The royal couple became symbols of British grit, walking through bombed neighborhoods, visiting troops, broadcasting steady voices into the storm. It worked. The monarchy, so recently shaken by Edward's departure, found new strength in George's quiet courage. But the pressure took a toll. Years of chain-smoking, anxiety, and ceaseless duty eroded his health. By the early 1950s, George was a frail man with a worn heart. On February 6, 1952, he died of a coronary thrombosis at Sandringham. His death marked the end of an era and the sudden beginning of another. His daughter, Elizabeth, would ascend the throne within hours, but behind the public spotlight, another royal was fading into a quieter legacy. She had no throne to inherit, no scandal to escape, only a life built around duty, nursing, and a war fought with bandages instead of bullets. And just like that, The stammering spare became the symbol of a nation at war. If you're still with us through kings, crises, and coronations, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of this royal saga. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you deep in a late-night binge or squeezing in some royal drama over lunch? We want to know. 3. Mary, Princess Royal. Mary, the only daughter of George V, was born in 1897 and came into the world as the middle anchor of her brothers, a steadying presence in a family built on rank and rivalry. She wasn't a headline maker like Edward, nor a reluctant monarch like Albert. Instead, she built a life around the quiet power of service. In an age when royal daughters were expected to be ornamental, Mary made herself indispensable. As a teenager during the First World War, she threw herself into the national effort. Her Princess Mary's Christmas gift fund of 1914 sent brass boxes filled with tobacco, chocolate, and postcards to troops at the front. Millions of men received one. It was more than a gesture. It was a tangible reminder that the royal family saw them as individuals, not just numbers in uniform. She also lent her name and time to the British Red Cross Voluntary Aid Detachments, visiting hospitals and comforting wounded soldiers. For a young royal barely out of school, it was a crash course in responsibility. In 1922, she married Henry Lascelles, later the 6th Earl of Harewood. They built their home at Harewood House in Yorkshire, far from the ceremonial bustle of London. Mary became Princess Royal in 1932, an honorific reserved for the sovereign's eldest daughter. But titles weren't her only contribution. During the Second World War, she took on leadership roles as Controller Commandant of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, and became closely linked with the Princess Mary's Royal Air Force Nursing Service. She wasn't just signing papers, she was touring camps, speaking with women in uniform, and lending moral force to their work. By the time she died suddenly in 1965, while walking on the grounds of Harewood House, she had lived a life defined by steadiness and quiet influence. No scandals, no abdications, just decades of consistent duty, proving that in a family of extremes, steadiness can be its own form of rebellion. But not all of George V's children would find such balance. The next son, the third born after Edward and Albert, chose a very different path, one of military service, distant postings, and the rare distinction of ruling not as a king, but as a royal governor on the far side of the world. 4. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Prince Henry, born in 1900, was the third son of George V and the most traditionally royal in temperament. Reserved, dutiful, and almost aggressively unremarkable in the eyes of the press, he lacked the charm of Edward or the quiet magnetism of Albert. But what Henry had was consistency, a lifelong sense of military discipline, and a knack for staying exactly where the crown needed him, even if that place was somewhere as distant and disorienting as post-war Australia. Like his brothers, Henry served in the military from a young age. Commissioned into the King's Royal Rifle Corps, he later trained at Sandhurst and followed a steady path through the British Army. While others in the family were shaking up the monarchy or shouldering it through global catastrophe, Henry carved out a solid, if understated, career as a working royal and professional officer. In 1935, he was created the Duke of Gloucester, further formalizing his role within the royal hierarchy. But his most unusual assignment came in 1945, when he was appointed Governor-General of Australia, the first and only royal to hold the post in the 20th century. It was a delicate diplomatic role, placing him at the symbolic head of a country increasingly assertive in its independence. With World War II just ending, the appointment was seen as both a nod to imperial ties and an effort to steady a shifting Commonwealth. He arrived with his wife, Lady Alice Montagu Douglas Scott, and their young son, Prince Richard, who spent part of his early childhood in Canberra. Henry's time in Australia wasn't scandalous or dramatic, but it was significant. He represented a version of the monarchy that was reliable, adaptable, and, crucially, willing to serve where needed, no matter how far from the palace steps. He returned to the UK in 1947 and continued public duties well into old age. But not everything in his family would follow such a clean arc. In 1972, his eldest son, Prince William of Gloucester, died tragically in an air race crash, a bitter reminder that even the most stable branches of the royal tree aren't immune to sudden breaks. And then there was Henry's younger brother, handsome, cosmopolitan, and cut from a very different cloth. The Duke of Kent lived fast, dressed sharp, and crashed into history like a meteor. Brilliant, brief, and gone too soon. 5. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Prince George, born in 1902, was the royal who flirted most with the modern world. Polished, urbane, and far more cosmopolitan than his older brothers, George seemed like someone born slightly ahead of his time. A royal who wasn't just comfortable in court life, but equally at home in jazz clubs, civil service offices, and foreign embassies. In an era when monarchy still clung to its Victorian rituals, George was brushing shoulders with diplomats, thinkers, and trendsetters. Early in his career, George took a route rarely chosen by royalty, the civil service. He worked in both the Foreign Office and the Home Office, giving him experience beyond the ceremonial. This was no empty title holder. He was engaged in real policy work, moving in the administrative corridors of government while still upholding royal duties. His marriage to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in 1934 was not only a grand royal affair, but a diplomatic union of two royal houses hit hard by the 20th century's upheavals. Together they had 3 children, Edward, later Duke of Kent, Princess Alexandra, and Prince Michael of Kent. But it was during World War II that George's path took its most dramatic turn. He joined the Royal Navy, later transferring to the Royal Air Force, keen to serve actively in the war effort. Unlike his brothers, who stayed largely within the protective perimeter of symbolic leadership, George put himself on the front lines of military service. And then came the crash. In 1942, George was killed in an air accident while flying over Scotland. His plane, a short Sunderland, went down near Caithness. He became the first royal to die on active military service in over 500 years. The loss was jarring. He was just 39 years old, full of potential, and already emerging as the modern face of royalty, a bridge between the rigid past and a more contemporary international role. His death left a deep scar on the royal family and a lingering question of what might have been had he lived longer. Yet even as his siblings grew into kings, governors, and commanders, there was one more child of George V, one rarely seen in public, one whose story was often softened or misunderstood. His name was Prince John, and unlike his brothers and sister, his journey stayed quietly tucked away from the cameras and crowds. 6. Prince John. He was the youngest, the quietest, and for much of the 20th century the most misunderstood. Born in 1905, Prince John was the 6th and final child of King George V and Queen Mary. His life was short, just 13 years, but in its brevity it became shrouded in myth, speculation, and often unfair assumptions. For decades, Prince John was whispered about as the hidden royal, the boy shut away because he didn't fit the mold. But the truth, like many royal stories, is more human than it is sinister. John was, by all accounts, a lively and affectionate child. He had the same mischievous energy as any boy his age and spent his early years in the company of his siblings, included in family outings, photos, and letters. But around the age of 4 or 5, signs of epilepsy began to appear. As the seizures grew more frequent and severe, his life inevitably changed. The early 20th century was not kind to children with medical challenges, and the royal household, bound by protocol, tradition, and deep discomfort with vulnerability, had few tools to handle such a diagnosis. By his later years, John lived primarily at Wood Farm, a modest residence on the Sandringham estate, where he was cared for by his devoted governess, Charlotte Lala Bill. Far from being hidden away in cruelty, John was surrounded by a small circle of caretakers who genuinely loved him. His daily life included gardening, puzzles, animals, and as much structure as his condition would allow. It was not a palace life, but it was a life. On January 18, 1919, John suffered a severe seizure and passed away. He was buried quietly at St. Mary Magdalene Church, not far from where he had lived. He was just 13. His death deeply affected Queen Mary and King George V, both of whom had struggled to cope with his condition, but mourned him as any parents would. In later years, popular memory distorted his story into a Gothic footnote, a symbol of royal coldness or secrecy. But modern scholarship has begun to reclaim John's life as something simpler, sadder, and more honest. A boy born into a world that didn't yet know how to care for him properly, but who was not forgotten by those who loved him. With John's passing, the line of George V's children came to its quiet close. Kings, governors, philanthropists, and fallen princes. 6 lives branching out from a single monarch, each leaving behind echoes in a royal legacy still unfolding today.